And then I stop how far before for question and answers?
Is everybody ready?
About 10 minutes?
11:50 will be
It's finished.
11:50 finish.
Look, it is a great pleasure and a treat to have now a couple of guest lectures by Paula, who is one of my heroes, has been for a very long time. Paula is an award-winning scientist and activist and communicator, and now she's a big TV personality in Africa. She said to you about her work in Canada. She's a Princeton PhD. I got to know you when you were a student here a long time ago. It seems like a long time ago. When did you get your degree?
2002.
2002, yeah. A time ago.
Shouldn't have said that.
And so Paula's going to talk. Her perspective, she's interested in the whole constellation of nexus problems, but her work is focused primarily on wildlife, which is an acute risk in Kenya in particular, but also in Africa, in general. And her narrowest of interests and her most stunning victories have been with respect to elephant conservation. So without further ado, Paula.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, students. I hope that you're all enjoying this incredible sunshine. I arrived yesterday and it was miserable. So I'm really happy that it's sunny today. I want to pretend that I brought the sun, but I'm from Kenya, born and raised there. It is really an incredible country in terms of its wildlife and biodiversity. Let me just have a quick show of hands. How many of you have ever been to Africa or to Kenya? Wow, that's amazing. How many Kenya alone? Okay, great. I'm sure that most people, when they think about my beautiful country, is the wildlife. As Steve said, Kenya has a unique array of megafauna: elephants, rhinos, giraffes, hippos. We have an incredible amount of diversity. A lot of people also think of Kenya in terms of other kinds of heroic acts, like Eliud Kipchoge's recent, shattering the 2-minute or 2-hour barrier in the marathon. I hope some of you guys watched that I don't know if you'd call it a race, but that run. And these are the two things that a lot of people relate Kenya to. Positive things: our coffee, our landscapes, the cradle of mankind, our biodiversity. But there's also a part of Africa, not just Kenya, that a lot of people tend to see in the media. I work in the media, and I'm constantly amazed at how much negative press comes out of Africa. And it's very hard to get good stories or positive stories into the international media. And I've heard this from journalists as well. So wars, armed warfare, famine, too many people, poaching, diseases, all kinds of negative things about Africa generally predominate or dominate the media that's coming out of the continent. And I want to remind you of one of Africa's most celebrated heroines, Wangari Maathai. She is Kenya's only Nobel Peace Prize winner, an environmentalist who challenged the government, putting her life at risk to protect green spaces in our urban areas. Well, Africa is sometimes referred to as a country. I know that when I was in Princeton, we had a course in Kenya which was often described as the Africa field course, as if Africa was a small place. Africa is gigantic. It's incredibly diverse, and there are many different stories to think about from Africa. 54 countries, population of 1.3 billion people, a GDP that is dwarfed by the US GDP, only representing a third of the United States GDP. But the growth rate of the economies in Africa is quite high, 3.7% on average. And a third of the countries in Africa have a GDP which is 6%. So among the fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa as well. This is really, really important because growth comes with consequences. The per capita GDP in Africa is quite small. It's the poorest continent on the planet. And it's also the youngest continent. The median age of Africans is 19 years old. How many of you guys here are 19 or around 19? Yeah, imagine if you were the median of this country. What does that mean? It means young people have the power to change so much. They control the outcomes of elections. And so they are an incredibly important and powerful, potent force in Africa. Now, the demographic dividend of this population is not expected until the year 2035. What that means is, by the time Africa's population reaches the kind of structure of a Western developed economy, it's going to be 2035. So for now, Africa will remain a developing country with a very young population. Africa is also still a very dark continent. This is a satellite image taken at night. Hardly any lights, hardly any development. And it's true that the lack of infrastructure, the lack of roads and railways and buildings and infrastructure are part of the reason why the economic development of Africa is lagging. There actually isn't the structure in place. But there are many other reasons why Africa is a poor continent. And this includes despotic regimes, corruption. In my country, corruption is, like the second word of every sentence. And the impact, the lasting impact of colonialization. I think it's sometimes discounted. People think that, well, Africans rule themselves now. Every African country has an African government. But the legacy of colonialism is still an incredibly strong chain on Africa. Well, this is my capital city, Nairobi. And if you come to Nairobi, you might think you could be anywhere in the world. It's like any other metropolis. It's green, it's clean, it's now quite safe, it's modern, it has high-speed internet. And this development has come about because of a trend that is happening across the entire continent. So all of the African countries, now about 60 years since independence, are getting together to develop a shared vision for the future. And this is called Agenda 2063. And this shared vision is quite interesting because all these presidents have sat together to come up with a vision that lasts longer than their own terms in office, which is unique. It hasn't happened really in the past. I grew up in Kenya, and I can tell you that every politician was busy looking at his or her personal gains during their term. But this is shifting. What we're seeing is a desire for shared prosperity across Africa, opening up of borders, allowing Africans to move easily between the different countries. Education, development of women and girls, and youth, and freedom from fear of diseases or wars and want. We're talking about the kind of prosperity that America, Europe, Australia already enjoys. Oh, I don't know what that is. Oh, I'm sorry, I clicked the wrong thing. That's why. I'm sorry. This thing is complicated. Do I click again? Or? Okay. So in the Agenda 2063, what you see is a list of aspirations. And I'm just going to show you one of them, because all of the aspirations are things that we can all relate to. But in aspiration 1, a prosperous continent, prosperous countries, inclusive growth and sustainable development. And when I see these kind of promises being made and commitments being made by governments, I always look for where's environment in all of this. And sure enough, at the very bottom, the very last item, after standards of living, education, health, economies, agriculture, blue ocean economies, is environmental. But when actually talking about sustainable climate, resilient economies, sustainably managed biodiversity, forests, land and water. We're not talking about wilderness here. We're talking about sustainable use and mitigating climate change risks. And this is something that really worries me, because I think that all over the world we're becoming to realize that this idea that we can utilize everything and not cause consequences down the road for future generations, we now know that we can't do that. We need wilderness. We need wild systems to function as wild systems. And Africa is particularly well placed because we still have large tracts of land that are virtually untouched. So Kenya is on the east coast of Africa, and I'm going to be telling you more about my country and what's happening on the ground, some of the things that I find very challenging and perhaps upsetting. We're a country of great diversity, strong cultures. We have 70 distinct ethnic groups, so great human diversity. Not surprising, probably, because this is actually where humanity evolved. So there are many different tribes and peoples and traditions. But it also means there's a lot of differences between people. We're also a country that straddles the equator and it straddles the Great Rift Valley. That means we have an enormous diversity of physical landscapes, geography. As a result, we have a lot of different types of habitats and a very, very high level of diversity. And what you see in this map is the dark red are areas of the highest biodiversity or species diversity. Kenya, Tanzania, and Congo are all considered mega diverse countries. So these are the countries that are home to much of Africa's richness and wealth in species. But what you'll see is that most of that wealth in species and habitats and environments is simply not recognized in the economies of our countries. So I'm going to take you through a lightning history of Kenya so that you understand a little bit about the background. Kenya has been occupied many times by different peoples and in different parts of the country. In 600 AD, the Arabs came to Kenya. We had Chinese people visiting and trading along the Kenyan coast. We were affected by the slave trade, although not by any means to the extent of West African coastlines. The Portuguese came, the Arabs chased them out. There were all these ongoing wars along the coast of Kenya, but it wasn't until the 1800s when the British arrived and they actually formally colonized Kenya. In 1895, they formed the British East Africa Protectorate, and they took over control of the whole country, moved people away from where they lived and had originally used the land, moved pastoralists. So pastoralists make up an enormous proportion of the Kenyan population, but they moved them away from certain areas in order to secure land for themselves. They built a railway so that they could get to Uganda and exploit Uganda as well. And in the 1940s, Kenyans began to fight back for independence. By 1963, we got that independence, which means for only 55 years, Kenya has been an independent country. We were colonized, strongly colonized by the British for 65 years. And during that colonization, it was similar to, if not worse, than the apartheid regime. So a quick, personal history. My mother is British. My father is Kenyan from somewhere close to Mount Kenya. They couldn't be married in Kenya because in those days, it was illegal for a white woman to marry a black man. So in terms of history, this is extremely recent, this whole colonization and the effect of colonization. So Kenya became independent, held its very first multi-party election, so democracy, true democracy didn't come until the 1990s. And then we also were affected by terrorism. And this terrorism, the bombing of the US embassy had nothing to do with Kenya's role in anything. It was more related to the US war on terrorism. And so since then, Kenya has been affected by terrorism coming from Somalia. In 2007, we had a very violent election, which some of you may recall. And that led to a new constitution. So finally, Kenya has created its own constitution developed by the people of Kenya, for the people of Kenya. We elected our president, Uhuru Kenyatta, who has only 2 more years left of his reign. Today, Kenya is the 4th richest country in Africa, and it's now classified as a lower middle-income country. One of the things that Uhuru Kenyatta has done, and his predecessor, Mwai Kibaki, is to try and drive Kenya's economic growth on a roadmap defined by Vision 2030. And this is part of the whole African Union aspirations as well. So this vision was developed by some technocrats who sat in a room and said, we should be an industrialized nation. Why? Because Kenya's population is so young. Every year, 1 million young people enter into the job market. And those people need jobs. And less than 20% will get jobs. That means there's a lot of unemployment. About 40% of those young people will not get a job in their first year. So the idea is, let's industrialize, everybody will be able to get a job and will be able to provide a high quality of life. This is the thinking, and it's the same thinking that China has gone through, or Malaysia, and many other countries. Our Vision 2030 is founded on, I would say this is like the foundational part of it, the very bottom, right? So development of institutions, government agencies, adequate energy, science, technology, and innovations, land reforms, and development of human resources, so human capital, meaning education, security, and those kind of reforms that will enable the economy to grow. And then there are 3 major pillars: economic, social, and political. You can look at this for as long as you want. You won't see the word environment, right? There really hasn't been a recognition and an appreciation of the importance of that natural capital that Kenya has, which is unique in Africa. We really are the superpower of safari or savanna ecosystems, and yet it's not captured in our economic growth plans. So our economic growth plans really look at things like achieving a very high economic growth rate as GDP, which means producing stuff, selling stuff, and tourism. The social side of it is improving the quality of life, so we're talking here about human welfare, health, education, and then the political governance, which is all to do with the promotion of good democracies, but also combating corruption. Our president, as I mentioned, has only got 2 more years left on his timesheet. And so he has come up with an agenda which he calls his Big Four, his Big Four action plan. And when he put out this Big Four action plan, I immediately ran a press piece saying, you've got to change this to the Big Five, right? Everyone knows the Big Five is 5 animals, and it will immediately remind people that our agenda should include wildlife and conservation. But he didn't. He said, don't worry, it's all embedded in everything else, which is just a way of saying we're not going to actually deal with it. So the Big Four are the major development agendas which are currently taking place in Kenya at lightning speed. It's actually really fantastic and scary at the same time. Food security, affordable housing, manufacturing, and healthcare for all. So these are some of the, I'm not sure if you guys can see this, but some of the simple things that are happening, which are what we're witnessing on the ground in the country. Our economy is growing quite rapidly at about 6% per annum. We have 45% of Kenyans now have access to electricity, and the electrification program is taking place so rapidly that there are massive wind plants going up all over the place, geothermal power plants, attempts to build coal power plants, and power going into every school across the nation. That means all children can now use computers in their classrooms. We also have, I don't know if you can see that, about 30% of the population has access to the internet. It may be actually a lot more than that, because so long as you're in a place which has phone network, which is maybe 80% of the country, then you can access the internet, because every phone, almost every phone can get internet access. So something like 65% of Kenyans use their phones to go onto the internet. Our population is about 48 million, and it is still growing. And what we're seeing is an incredibly rapidly developing urban centers like Nairobi, this is the city of Nairobi, but all the other urban centers are also growing, and people are moving into the cities in search of jobs. And of course, these cities are being fueled from resources from all around the country, and this is where the impact comes in. So most countries, as they develop at a pace, and they put in place what we call environmental impact assessments, and we examine what are the impacts of these developments, and we take care of those, we mitigate against them. So for example, if you look at the agricultural policies for Kenya, you'll see massive conversion of land for agriculture. And this isn't always successful. So for example, just in the last 48 hours, one of the biggest farming companies has declared that it's going to shut down 2 of its major farms. That's doesn't just mean there'll be less food production, land is left derelict, but it also means that tens of thousands of people will be out of jobs. But what is also happening in the conversion of land is we are destroying habitats, leading to local extinctions of some species. We're using enormous amounts of pesticides and herbicides because our laws cannot keep up with these developments. Many of the pesticides and herbicides which have been banned in the US, for example, Roundup has just been banned over here. You can walk into any store in Kenya and you can buy Roundup off the shelf. These chemicals are sometimes not even used for the target purpose because many of the people using these chemicals are not even educated, so they may use them for other purposes, knowingly or unknowingly, but basically poisoning themselves and the land. It's causing pollution in the rivers and lakes, creating dead zones, which affects, of course, fisheries. And it also creates an environment where invasive species can proliferate. Many of you may have heard of this very noxious plant called water hyacinth. It came from South America originally, and it is just invading parts of Kenya's lake system. If you go to Kisumu, which is our major port on the Lake Victoria, you can't even get a boat down to the city anymore. The weed has occupied the lake to such an extent that for several kilometers, all you can see is lake weed. We also have, of course, toxic waste. So many industries are coming up in Kenya. Many countries are bringing their chemical industries into Kenya because of the cheap labor and access to energy because of all this growth in the energy availability, which is resulting in a huge amount of toxic pollution. We're talking of not just air pollution, but water pollution as well. And then, of course, we have the same problem as every country with plastic wastes. But Kenya, unlike many countries, has actually instituted a plastic bag ban. So that has taken care of a part of that problem. So we have this challenge. Most of our farmers are not people who are making a decent living. They are very poor people. And for them, you know, they're hoping that this growth in the economy is going to bring wealth to them. But these are the kind of situations that many of our farmers live in. These are farmers who literally live in a plastic bag house on this farm. They are often temporary workers. It's you know, as the agricultural revolution takes place in Kenya, these are the kind of challenges that we have to think about. And as a conservationist, I can't pretend that this isn't something that we have to take care of. While these guys are poor and they're struggling, they're trying to make a living, I wouldn't want to put them out of a job in order to save elephants. And yet these farms are at risk from animals like elephants. Affordable housing. This is Kibera, one of the most well-known slums in Africa. Houses are made from mud. They sometimes call their place Chocolate City. It doesn't, you know, you can't help but feel for these guys. We need proper decent housing. We can't say no to it. But decent housing also results in all kinds of other challenges. One of the other major threats in Kenya, of course, is health. And most people think of malaria, HIV, and these kinds of diseases. Actually, cancer is now one of the fastest growing health crises in Kenya. And I believe it's got a lot to do with the knock-on effects of chemicals and pollution in the environment. What we're seeing now is cancer is number 3 as a source of death, and 7% of all the deaths in the country are arising from cancer. 60% of Kenyans with cancer are younger than 70. So it's not an old people's disease, really. It's a disease that's affecting quite young people as well. The reason why it's such a crisis is because for every 3,000 patients, there's only one oncologist in the country. So again, it's hard to say to the country, to our president, shift your attention, please look at the biodiversity when we have this kind of an emergency on our hands. And this is what a typical hospital looks like in a rural area. This was a woman who I met. She had been tossed by an elephant. She was injured. She was abandoned in a hospital by the authorities. They literally just picked her up, put her in the hospital, and left her there. She would have died if we hadn't asked questions and gone to find her and supported her and gave her food, changed her bedding, and took care of her. And she's fine today, but most of the hospitals don't have the kind of healthcare system that we have in other parts of the world. So there are many, many reasons why I would say we're in a very, very difficult situation. We want development, but there are loads of challenges. Kenya's education level is not very high. We have loads of people making it through high school, but fewer than 18% of Kenyans go to college. Fewer than 18%. We have 70 universities now in the country, so that is shifting quickly. The household income in Kenya, it's only $250 per household. So you can imagine, these are people who hardly have any disposable income. They're paying rent, they're paying for food, they're paying for schooling. How do we balance that with our concerns about the environment? Because every time we go to the government, we say we need more support for environment, for mitigation, for protection of our wild species and wild spaces. And we are always reminded that there are all these other priorities. And this is what some of our schools look like. This is a school in Amboseli. When I showed this picture to friends of mine, they said, well, at least the kids are getting fresh air. You could say that, but really this is not a learning environment for small children. And we all know that at this age, this is the most important time of their development. So 3 key things that we need to achieve in order to deliver on our development, which I do believe every country and every person in our country deserves a decent life, a decent healthcare, decent education, decent jobs. We need a democracy that works, a government that works, freedom from corruption, and of course rule of law. And in my talk later this week, we'll be talking a bit more about rule of law and wildlife and conservation. So I'm sure you've been hearing in some of the other lectures that we are facing a global biodiversity crisis. It's not just Kenya and it's not just Africa. In fact, the threats in our continent are probably lagging what's happening in other parts of the world. We do know that global food production is the major source of wildlife habitat loss and degradation, and therefore the extinctions of species. And agriculture already occupies a third of the surface area of the earth. If you look at Africa, you'll see that most of our landscapes are not affected by agriculture yet, but this is all changing very rapidly. Whoops. As I mentioned, Africa's population is very young. In Kenya, there are 9 million young people, and this is an audience of people that everybody's interested in getting attention from, because they will decide the fate of elections as our democratic economies grow. Our youth are actually not very well informed, particularly about issues relating to the environment. So our school system focuses on STEM. There's a lot of attention on mathematics and English. There's zero attention to environment, conservation, biodiversity, or any of the issues that we're talking about here in the Nexus class. In fact, the school system doesn't even talk about agriculture, and yet most school children never even go to high school. So primary school, most children will leave school at primary level, and they will be out fending for themselves without some very basic knowledge. And these are the kind of young people that we see, in the streets in Kenya. I find it really interesting that our kids are super smart, but access to information, access to education is very, very limiting. And many people still live in rural areas in the same landscape with wildlife, with predators like lions and hyenas, with elephants and zebras. And the poverty levels are astounding. Kenya's GDP is made up 12% from tourism. And yet these people who live in the same landscapes with that wildlife are not benefiting from that economy. There are many large international tourism companies that are making a killing from the tourism industry. But the people who live with these animals are not yet benefiting from it. And so this is an area of change that I'm interested in driving. How do we make sure that the people who live with wildlife are willing to continue to live with wildlife, to secure these populations, many of which are migratory, by ensuring an equitable distribution of the benefits and profits from tourism. Another major challenge we face is pastoralism. Pastoralism, 30% of the country are pastoralists, and livestock and wildlife share the same land. This is a place down in Amboseli. And what you see is that at the height of the drought, what was quite a large water pond has literally been reduced to a little muddy puddle. This is shared with wildlife and livestock, which means that we have an incredible level of conflict between livestock and wildlife. And we see an enormous amount of degradation of the landscape because of the browsing and grazing of livestock and wildlife. And at the same time, our country has that kind of very basic lifestyle for people living in rural areas. We are rapidly developing kind of space-age ideas. This is a plan for a new highway through the city of Nairobi. It's not just in the city of Nairobi, it's actually through the middle of the only green space left in the city. And so while some of us in conservation, who are not very many, are busy championing protection of our parks and protected areas and the people who live around our protected areas and maintaining the corridors and the connectivity, we have other challenges like this, which literally was announced yesterday, that the government has approved a project by the Chinese to build a massive highway right through the middle of the city, through Uhuru Park, which is our freedom park, basically. So these are the kind of really upsetting and disturbing things that we're constantly, challenged by our government. Some people would look at this picture and say, but we'd love to have that because it looks like Shanghai or Beijing or Dubai. And unfortunately, that's the reality. A lot of people think development is, skyscrapers and fancy concrete. The media hasn't exactly been a good friend either. The media has really shone a light on all the negative things about wildlife. And so for decades, we've been seeing stories about how animals threaten people, kill children, how people kill animals. And not on, why are animals special? We don't get National Geographic in Kenya. You can't watch animals on TV and fall in love with them because you only see this kind of news. It's always, animals get into the news if they've done something really destructive. And as a result, many of our wildlife does get killed in conflict, as a result of conflict, or simply out of fear. In this case, it was a lioness who was killed because she was hunting livestock in a homestead very close to Nairobi. And all these children were brought out of school. All the schools in the area were shut down, and the kids were brought to see their first lion. And you can imagine, this is the kind of education. So we're struggling with, not only is there no content in the schools, but the kind of material that children are being exposed to is really undermining the conservation story in Africa. Part of the challenge is that our people are not only uneducated, they're dependent on the environment when we're outside of the cities. This is again near Amboseli, where people depend on the environment for their energy, for their water, for their food, and their livestock. Finding a nice balance for people in this kind of a situation, at the same time having a modern economy, is, I think, the big challenge that all African countries are going to be facing. And many of these wilderness areas are under huge threat. So this is the railway, which has just been completed. If you'd heard my talk last year, we were talking about the beginning of this railway. This is a Chinese-built railway. In only 3 years, they completed a 500-kilometer railway right through a protected area. And On the one hand, they did elevate the railway in order to allow animals to go through it in some sections over many parts of this railway. There hasn't been that possibility, and many animals, elephants and other animals, can't cross the railway area and end up getting hit by vehicles on the road. This is, I think, just a signal and a sign of China's incredible impact in Africa. The development of infrastructure by China is just dwarfing all development by any other country in the continent. This railway is not just going to go through Kenya, it's going to go all the way through to Uganda and Rwanda and out all the way across Central and West Africa. You can imagine the impact it's going to have as it crosses across all these incredible landscapes. And the troubling thing is that it's not that we don't want railways, it's not that we don't want development, it's that the way that these developments are happening at such a fast speed without going through the due process is why we have so many negative impacts. And we know better than this. We've seen the impacts of roads and railways in everywhere else in the world, and so there's no reason why we can't use best practice and improve the way that we do these developments. But it's very hard to challenge and champion conservation and environment when it's missing from our general conversation, it's missing from television and all the media that people consume, it's missing from our education systems, it's missing from our leadership and from their communications and from the vision. It's very hard to push for better, more ecologically sustainable developments. As a result of all of this development and degradation and expansion of the human population and agriculture, what we're seeing is a huge impact on our wildlife. And I'm just going to point you to this graph over here. So here are the species. As you can see, sheep, goats, camels, donkeys, cattle. Between 1977 and 2013, increase in sheep and goats by 76%. Camels by 13%, donkeys 6%, cattle declined by 25%. And this is really, really telling that what's happening is the land is so degraded that even the livestock industry is affected negatively because cattle are the major source of income for the pastoral communities. We're also seeing a rise in the number of camels because the land is so dry that you need these species which are very hardy in these dry environments. Sheep and goats are the major cause of this decline. And what we're seeing with many of our other species, all these wildlife animals, populations are dropping. Some of them very significantly. Down here, topi, hartebeest, impala, grevy's zebra, and waterbuck. Populations are literally falling off the map. So nobody yet is saying extinction in Kenya, but a species like the grevy's zebra, which has been studied by Dan Rubenstein here at Princeton for decades, I learned just recently that this species is in so much trouble that they literally have to bring them hay to feed them during the dry season. Otherwise, their foals wouldn't survive. That is how critical the situation is. And of course, for animals like elephants, we get a lot of attention and a lot of interest. Our elephants are actually doing quite well. Populations are rebounding. Poaching is way down. But it's not the same for other species. Sometimes when I raise these issues in Kenya, people complain to me and they say, but you know, it's not fair to just complain, which may be fair. In context, Kenya's, while I feel very sad and troubled by the decline of the wilderness and the decline of species, in terms of our carbon footprint, it's actually not too high. It's only 0.3 metric tons per person in Kenya. And compare that to the US, I think it's, I don't know, between 17 and 20 metric tons. Is that right, Steve? Per person? So the carbon footprint of people in the United States is, you know, many, many times greater, more than 60 times more than in Kenya. But that doesn't mean that Kenyans shouldn't have a responsibility towards protecting that environment and using green industries. The challenges that we're facing in Africa are actually enormous. By 2050, we'll have 2.3 billion people. over 830 million young people and 10 to 12 million Africans joining the workforce every year. So I guess every African president is kind of stuck on dealing with this problem that they have of so many young people entering into the job pool because our bulge is moving up, right? It's going to be a very, very challenging time between now and 2035, which is why the acceleration of development is just steaming ahead. And it's very hard for voices, for conservationists to make a difference. But it's really important that we do keep speaking out. If Africa fails to address this population bulge of young people coming into the job market, the consequences could be very severe. 79% of the immigrants from Africa are economic immigrants. And people without jobs could end up joining forces like Al-Qaeda. There are parts of Kenya where these Al-Qaeda offshoots like Al-Shabaab come into Kenya, offer jobs to young people. They're probably Christians or animists. They may not have any religion at all, but they're getting $1,000 a month, and that's a lot of money. And they'll do anything. And so this is why it's really important to our governments to actually keep up the momentum on development. And the other big factor is that China is offering incredibly good deals in terms of their funding and their loans to Africa. It's very different from the way the West has dealt with Africa. In the past, Europe and the US and other countries have made loans available to Africa, but with strings attached, especially relating to the governance systems in the countries and democracy. China has waved all that aside and said, we just want to have roads and railways. Why? Because China needs access to the interior of Africa. They need access to the resources. So I'm going to give you guys a few minutes for questions and answers, and I will be talking again on Wednesday, a different slant of the same story. But I want to offer you guys some voluntary homework. Considering the challenges we're facing in Africa, imagine if it was here in the United States. Imagine if Trump said, well, you know what, we're going to give the Chinese a contract. We're not going to ask you guys for permission either. We're just going to give them a contract to build a 6-lane expressway right through the middle of Central Park. What would you do? Thank you. I think we have a few minutes for questions.
The 40% of people who join Al-Qaeda and ISIS, is it really that high?
Sorry?
The 40%, is it that high?
Let me just go back. So what I'm saying here is that the people who join ISIS, so surveys have been done on people who have joined ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and they have found that the reason why they join, 40% of the people who join because of economic reasons. They don't join because they're fanatic, they want to go out blowing up themselves. Yeah, does that make sense?
Hi, I'm Alex.
Hi, Alex.
So I was wondering if now that developed countries are developing technology at a very rapid pace, do you think that through sharing that technology with currently developing countries, their development will be less carbon intensive and they will reach the level that we have without all of the destruction of the environment?
Yeah, thanks for that. So that's a really good question. That one of the biggest fears is as Africa develops, there will be a much greater carbon footprint. And Africa really is this, it's going through a development curve which is like this. So it's a really valid concern. Two things. First, Africa is developing technologies as well, which are actually being exported, which I think is quite fascinating. People forget that Africa isn't just a place that's receiving technology. It's a continent that is exporting technologies as well. And in terms of some things, yes, absolutely. So for example, Kenya is, I think 25% of our energy is wind, right? So that is purely because Kenya made a commitment in Paris that we would be a low carbon energy country. So a big chunk of our energy is generated from wind, 45% of our energy is generated from geothermal, which is amazing. I think it's more than most countries in the world. I won't say it's not environmentally destructive, because actually people also make a big mistake in thinking that green means it's good. There are other consequences of wind. They're always put on the Rift Valley because it's this wonderful wind funnel. And of course, that's also where all the vultures, birds migrating through from the north come through that funnel as well. So they're killing a lot of birds. So in some cases, yes, Africa is benefiting enormously from this technology, this green technology, and lots of solar power plants coming up as well. And at the same time, we have another problem. Take General Electric. They can't put up coal power plants in Europe anymore. So guess where they're moving all their coal power plants? There are something like 25 coal power plants planned for Africa, which is crazy. So they've taken their technology, they've relabeled it ultra clean coal technology. Is there such a thing? Ultra clean coal technology. That's what they're calling it. And they've sold it to people. And there's a case in Kenya in a World Heritage Site where they tried to put up a coal power plant, which has been successfully fought by the local community. Even though that coal plant would generate power for a place which literally has no electricity today, they said absolutely no way. And part of it was because they had this great leadership that looked at it and said, there's no way you're putting up one coal power plant. You cannot do an energy economy on one coal power plant. You'll need several. And they were about to open up a huge coal mining industry. We don't have good quality coal in Kenya. It would mean actually ultra dirty coal. And I spoke to the people who did the environmental impact assessment. It's a project funded partly by General Electric and the Chinese. And it's a private industry, so local Kenyan industrialists were behind it. And I spoke to the environmental company. It was done by McKinsey. And he read to me some numbers, and he said, but look at these numbers. And I said, well, how do you know those numbers are true? And he said, well, if they are true, it's going to be great. I said, yeah, but it's never been tested. You cannot let Kenya be this guinea pig. So there is a real problem that as Germany decommissions their coal plants, as China also turns away from coal, they're moving all that technology to Africa, and some African countries are just gobbling it up. So that's a big challenge. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I don't have the microphone. There's people over here. Okay.
Instead of a very small number of Kenyans receive college education,
Yeah.
so the ones who do today, many other countries, that the ones with higher education will leave the country and get better jobs elsewhere. Is that the case in Kenya as well?
There's always been a concern in Kenya about brain drain. Educated Kenyans going abroad looking for jobs, and I think every country goes through that actually. In our case, I would say the worst evidence of that is in the medical fraternity. So Kenya trains doctors and nurses, and most of them go and work in other countries where they get much better pay, because our government hospitals obviously don't pay very well. So that's a big challenge in certain sectors. But also just think about it. You have this vibrant economy that is growing at 6%. So people are creating their own jobs. Not everyone can do it because it requires capital. And so that's why one of the major macroeconomic drivers is financial institutions, access to funding and that kind of thing. It's a big challenge. I mean, I've met people with master's degrees who cannot get a job. We have people with degrees who are homeless in the streets of Kenya, and it's become a big news issue in Kenya. And unfortunately, many of the new jobs that are coming with all this development, like roads and railways and power lines and pipelines, many of those jobs are not college jobs, right? Those are technical jobs, but there are no technical schools left because Kenya did something the Britain did. We went from, practical technical colleges to academic colleges. And so now you don't have people who know how to weld and do that kind of technical work, electronics and mechanical engineering. It's missing in the whole job sector. So that's a big problem. And so what you're seeing, and it's not just Kenya, you're seeing it across Africa. The Chinese are flooding in and filling in all these gaps, which is a huge challenge.
People, I know a lot of you have to get to your next gig, so you should feel free to move. I'm sure Paul will continue to answer questions on that.
Thanks, everyone.